Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and check out the other videos on the channel. And if you enjoy this one, don't forget to share it with someone who might like it too. The news reached Sarah Miller on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday morning, the kind that offered no hint that the course of her life was about to pivot. She had been packing her son's lunch for school, half listening to the local radio and half arguing silently with the broken toaster, when the envelope slid through the mail slot with a small metallic clatter. It was the kind of envelope that didn't belong among utility bills or supermarket flyers' heavy paper. Embossed stamp, her name typed rather than handwritten. Even before she opened it, she felt something tighten beneath her ribs, the quiet intuition that what waited inside would not be easily set aside. She had been right. Her grandfather, Harvey Miller, the man she had not seen in almost 12 years, was dead. The letter from the probate office explained it all in dry, orderly language. The estate was modest, but required a designated family member to oversee its sorting and closure. Harvey had named her. There was no explanation for his choice, no personal note, no message left behind. Only a single line included in the legal summary, attributed to her grandfather's final directives. Preserve what matters. She stared at those words for a long time, unable to decide whether they irritated her or unnerved her. Harvey had never been a sentimental man, at least not in any ways she had been old enough to understand. Why he would think to burden her with the remnants of his life was beyond her, and yet something about that short phrase made her feel as if she were being pulled back to a place she had long resisted returning to. Her 8-year-old son, Noah, had wandered into the kitchen and noticed her expression change as she reread the letter. He asked what was wrong, and she told him gently that they would need to take a trip soon, that her grandfather had passed away. Noah paused only long enough to nod in that way children do when the world shifts, but they don't yet know how to react to it. He hardly knew who Harvey was. The old man had existed for him only in the form of a name and a few dusty photographs kept in a shoebox. Still, he sensed the weight that settled across his mother's shoulders and remained quiet for the rest of the morning. By the next day, after filling out leave forms at work and arranging for their neighbor to check on the apartment, Sarah and Noah were driving across the desert toward the small Arizona town of Destrayville. The road was long and straight, cutting through miles of ochre sand and scraggly shrubs that bowed under the wind. The deeper they drove into the desert, the more Sarah felt her reluctance knot inside her. She had grown up near Destrayville, though she had left the area before she turned 20 and never looked back. Memories of her grandfather's property, once a place where metal creaked and tools clattered late into the night, floated through her mind without invitation. When she and Noah finally reached the outskirts of the town, the familiar shape of the old water tower rising crooked against the sky, she felt that unwelcome blend of nostalgia and dread, like stepping back into a dream she had never wanted to revisit. Destrayville itself had not changed much. A few new storefronts had appeared along Main Street, but the faded gas station and the half-empty diner still looked exactly as she remembered them. The people, too, seemed unchanged, their sideways glances as she drove past containing the same mix of curiosity and suspicion she recalled from her childhood. Her grandfather's reputation had lingered in town like a stubborn stain. People used to say he spent too much time tinkering with contraptions no one understood and not enough time socializing. Rumors had rippled through Destrayville for years that Harvey had driven away his own family with his eccentricity, that he hoarded scraps and machinery because he believed he was on the brink of some breakthrough, that he refused help even when he needed it most. Sarah had grown tired of hearing the whispers and left as soon as she could. The dirt road leading to the Miller property was rougher than she remembered. The tires of her aging SUV kicked up dust and gravel, leaving a pale cloud behind. When the house finally came into view, perched slightly above the flat sprawl of the desert, it looked smaller than it had in her childhood memories, though no less worn by the years. Wooden siding clung to the frame in places and peeled away in others. The porch sagged at one end. Several windows were either cracked or clouded with grime. The wind pushed a scattering of dried tumbleweed against the front steps. It was exactly the kind of place she'd expected Harvey to leave behind, stubborn and weather-beaten, refusing to give way even as the seasons devoured it. She parked beside the house, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment with her hands resting on the steering wheel. Noah gazed out the window with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She told him they were here and stepped outside into the dry, metallic heat. The smell of dust and sun-baked wood washed over her as she approached the porch, the boards groaning softly under her boots. For an instant, she could almost imagine the faint echo of her grandfather shuffling about inside, muttering to himself as he tinkered with yet another unfinished machine. But the house was silent now. The front door was stiff but unlocked. When she pushed it open, warm air, thick with dust, drifted outward. The inside of the house felt frozen in time, as if no one had set foot there in years. Shelves sagged with stacks of yellowed newspapers and old manuals. Tools lay scattered across a table near the window. A faded armchair sat in the corner beside a lamp whose bulb had long since burned out. It was a space that bore the unmistakable imprint of the man who had lived there, uncompromising, cluttered, driven by some inner logic that had made sense only to him. Noah wandered ahead of her, stepping carefully around scattered hardware and loose boards. His small voice echoed faintly as he called for her to come look at an old wooden door at the back of the hallway. When she joined him, she realized he had found the entrance to Harvey's workshop, a place she had thought would be locked, but was instead cracked open as though waiting for her. She hesitated, her hand on the handle before easing the door aside. The workshop was even more chaotic than the rest of the house. Every surface was covered with parts metal rods, gears, coils of wire, half-assembled devices whose purpose was indecipherable. The air carried a lingering scent of oil and burnt solder. Scattered across a central work table were stacks of stained notebooks filled with formulas, diagrams, and sketches. Sarah picked one up, flipping through pages filled with elaborate calculations that made her brow tense. She had studied engineering in college, and though she had since shifted away from technical work, she could still recognize complexity when she saw it. Yet much of what Harvey had written seemed beyond even her experience. Noah wandered along the far side of the workshop and paused beside a tall metal cabinet. He tugged at the handle, but the door didn't budge. When he called her over, Sarah examined the cabinet herself and found that it had likely been jammed shut by age or rust. She gripped the handle firmly and tugged, but just as the door shifted, the cabinet rocked slightly and her crowbar borrowed from a nearby crate slipped out of her hand and struck the floor. The clang echoed sharply, but something else caught her attention. A faint, hollow sound beneath the clang, as if the floor had answered back. She crouched and tapped her knuckles lightly against the boards. One section of the floor responded with a muffled thud that differed from the rest. Her curiosity sharpened. Kneeling more purposefully now, she felt along the edges until her fingertips brushed a thin groove in the wood. With effort, she pried upward, revealing a rectangular panel that lifted like a hidden door. A mild rush of cooler air drifted up. Noah peered over her shoulder, wide-eyed. Below them was a small, dimly lit space, half the height of a cellar, but crafted with purpose. Sarah lowered herself through the opening and dropped lightly to the ground. Dust rose around her in a gentle cloud. Resting in the center of the compartment was a metal safe, its surface worn but intact, along with a thick folder of documents tied with twine. Her pulse quickened. Harvey had always been secretive about his work, but she had never imagined anything like this. She brought the safe and the folder up into the workshop. The safe was surprisingly heavy, but a simple latch on the front allowed it to open without much difficulty. Inside lay several stacks of paper, a few small metal components, and multiple envelopes stamped with dates spanning decades. Sarah removed the top stack and unfolded one of the pages. Her breath caught. The diagrams were detailed representations of what appeared to be a thermal energy storage system, an intricate structure designed to capture, regulate, and release heat with remarkable efficiency. The equations suggested that the device operated by harnessing the extreme temperature gradients of desert climates, converting them into a stable and renewable energy source. The more she read, the more the magnitude of the discovery pressed upon her. She recognized theoretical concepts she had studied years ago, but had never seen realized with such precision. And yet it was clear Harvey had been working on these designs quietly, meticulously, refining them in secret over many years. At the bottom of one document was a handwritten note. "Protect this. Give it only to those who will understand." Her grandfather's familiar, sharp-edged handwriting made her chest tighten unexpectedly. Noah sat beside her, watching as she sifted through the papers. She could feel his curiosity prickling at the edges of hers. Closing the last folder, she looked up at the dusty room, suddenly seeing Harvey differently. Not simply as a stubborn recluse, but as someone who had been guarding something important, something he trusted no one else with until now. For a long moment, Sarah sat still, the quiet hum of desert wind pressing against the workshop windows. She had come to Destrayville expecting to settle a simple estate, pack a few belongings, and leave without looking back. But this was a doorway into a story she had never been told, and her grandfather had left the key in her hands. As the sun dipped behind the horizon outside, casting long shadows across the dusty floor, she understood that she was no longer here out of obligation. Something in this house demanded to be understood, and she would not leave until she uncovered the truth hidden within it. For the rest of that first night, sleep came to Sarah only in fragments, drifting and breaking apart like sand in the wind. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself seeing the diagrams again, the intricate loops and channels of heat flow, the equations that spiraled across the pages in her grandfather's careful, uncompromising hand. His note echoed in her mind with persistent clarity. "Protect this. Give it only to those who will understand." She had thought she knew the man he was, or at least the man he had seemed to be in the eyes of Destrayville. Now she was not sure she had ever known him at all. By morning, the heat had not yet risen, and the desert air still held the faint crispness of dawn. She stepped outside with a mug of instant coffee and stood on the creaking porch, letting the stillness settle over her. Noah slept late, worn out from the long drive and the heavy atmosphere of the previous day. She watched the horizon brighten, the sky shifting from pale lavender to gold, and she tried to gather her thoughts into something coherent. The safe, the diagrams, the hidden compartment, none of it felt accidental. Harvey had chosen to leave these things behind. He had chosen to name her in his will. Likely, he had known exactly what she would find, and perhaps he had counted on her curiosity, leading her deeper. After dropping the mug in the sink, she returned to the workshop and spent most of the morning organizing the scattered papers into neat stacks. Dust clung to her sleeves, The air smelled of metal and old oil. She arranged the documents according to the dates on their corners and separated sketches from written analyses. It was tedious work, but it helped her feel grounded amid the flood of new questions that pressed at her mind. Why had Harvey cut himself off from the scientific community? Had someone stolen his ideas before? And most urgently, just how significant was this discovery? Near midday, she lifted her phone and hovered over the contact list. For several years, she had kept the number of a former classmate and colleague, Dr. Jacob Linton, who now worked with a university lab in Stanford. They had crossed paths at a conference long ago, exchanging occasional emails afterward. He was someone whose judgment she trusted, someone who could distinguish between genius and misguided obsession. Finally convincing herself to do it, she snapped several photographs of the most legible diagrams and notes and sent them with a brief explanation. The reply came surprisingly fast. He asked for clearer scans. Then, after she sent more, he didn't write again for several hours. When her phone finally buzzed late that afternoon, she nearly dropped it. Jacob's response was short, but the tone of it was unmistakable. He wanted to speak over the phone. With her pulse quickening, she stepped outside, away from Noah's curious ears, and answered. His voice carried the unmistakable timbre of someone grappling with disbelief. He asked how she had come across these documents, whether she was absolutely certain they were her grandfather's work, and if she had any idea what she might be holding. She told him everything she knew, which in truth was not much. He fell silent for several seconds. Then he explained that what she had sent him appeared to be a functioning model for a thermal gradient energy system far more advanced than anything the current renewable energy market had implemented. If accurate, it would allow desert regions to store heat during the day and release it as power at night with unprecedented efficiency. It was the kind of leap forward companies spent hundreds of millions chasing. She asked him what that meant in practical terms. His answer made her sit down on the porch steps. He estimated that the underlying intellectual property could be valued somewhere in the range of $50 million, likely more when factoring in scalability and market demand. She could hardly breathe. Her grandfather, the man everyone in Destrayville had dismissed as a reclusive tinkerer, had developed something with the potential to reshape the entire energy landscape of the American Southwest. After promising to run the documents through more formal analysis, Jacob ended the call, leaving her in stunned silence. She stared out at the shimmering expanse of desert stretching toward the horizon, its heat rising in waves. $50 million. No wonder Harvey had hidden his work. No wonder he had trusted no one. She couldn't help but wonder how long he had carried this alone, watching time slip away while the world remained unaware. Inside the house, Noah had woken from his nap and stood in the doorway squinting at her. She motioned for him to come sit beside her. He did, resting his head lightly against her arm. She didn't know yet how to tell him everything, but she knew he sensed the shift in her mood. He had always been attuned to her that way. She simply told him she had discovered something important of his great-grandfather's, something that would require careful handling and a bit more time in Destrayville. He nodded, accepting this much without further questions, though his eyes lingered on her face, searching for reassurance. Later in the afternoon, she returned to sorting. As the sun lowered behind the hills, she felt the weight of eyes on her, not from inside the house, but from the road. When she glanced out the window, she spotted two figures leaning against a parked pickup at the end of the property. She recognized one of them as a man she had gone to school with, someone who had once teased her relentlessly about her grandfather's eccentricity. They stood there watching the house for several long moments before driving off. The unease settled in her stomach like a stone. Had someone seen her bring the documents out? Or had word of her return simply stirred old curiosity? Over the next few days, that curious tension in the air grew thicker. Whenever she went into town to buy supplies, she felt the weight of lingering stares. Conversations quieted around her. Strangers whispered to one another as she passed. It was clear that news of her arrival had spread quickly, and in a place like Destrayville, people rarely needed details before forming suspicions. If Harvey had indeed kept something secret, there were undoubtedly those who had tried to uncover it in the past, and some who might not appreciate the idea that his granddaughter had found what they could not. One morning, as she stepped outside to sweep the porch, she noticed footprints in the sand that did not match hers or Noah's. They led from the road to the side of the house where a window pane now hung crooked, its latch bent. She felt a cold rush beneath her skin. Someone had tried to get inside. Perhaps they had only wanted to look around, but the timing was too sharp to be coincidence. She checked every inch of the house, confirming nothing had been taken. It was not theft they were after, she realized. It was information. That night, she sat long after Noah had fallen asleep, staring at the stacked documents on the kitchen table. She had never imagined she would be responsible for something so valuable, so vulnerable. She considered leaving, taking the papers back to the city where she could more easily protect them. But another thought took root. If her grandfather had chosen this place to hide his work, perhaps it was because the desert had a way of keeping secrets safe. And maybe he had trusted her, not because she was the most qualified, but because she would not run when the work became difficult. She moved the documents into the bedroom and secured the door, more for peace of mind than anything else. Her mind churned long after she lay down. The following day brought no relief. As she swept the workshop floor, she heard two townspeople on the road talking loudly about how she had come back to dig for treasure, how she was stirring up the old man's mess. Their words stung, not because they mattered, but because they reminded her how quickly a small town could turn curiosity into hostility. And the more they talked, the more others would listen. Inside the workshop, she ran her fingers along the edges of her grandfather's notebooks and felt a growing determination. Perhaps the people of Destrayville had spent years misunderstanding Harvey, but she would not make that mistake. If his work held the power to change lives, then someone needed to see it through, to protect it the way he had tried to protect it alone. She realized with a quiet certainty that whatever challenges waited ahead, she could not abandon this responsibility. Not now, not after coming this far. When the sun dipped low and painted the desert in hues of molten gold, Sarah stood in the workshop doorway and watched the shadows lengthen across the sand. The wind whispered through the dry brush, carrying with it the voices of the past, the rumors that had shaped her childhood, the harsh judgments that had built walls around Harvey's life. But for the first time, she felt something else, an undercurrent of resolve, a sense of momentum pulling her forward. She was no longer simply the granddaughter returning to sort a house. She had become the keeper of a story that had been buried too long. And though she could feel the gaze of the town tightening around her, she also sensed that this was only the beginning. The deeper she ventured into her grandfather's legacy, the more she realized that she was stepping onto a path he had started laying many years before, one that led toward answers, danger, and perhaps a redemption neither of them had been granted in life. As darkness spread across the desert, she turned back into the house, knowing that the next days would test her in ways she had not yet imagined. But the decision had been made. She would protect what mattered. And in that silent promise, She carried her grandfather's voice with her, finally beginning to understand the truth he had hidden beneath the dust. The days that followed carried a slow, deliberate weight, as though the desert itself were holding its breath. Sarah woke each morning with the lingering awareness of being watched, not by an individual, but by the collective gaze of a town that had already begun shaping its own narrative about her return. She had expected some curiosity and perhaps a few unwelcome opinions, but the tension weaving through Destrayville felt deeper than idle gossip. It felt like expectation, like resentment, like an old wound being prodded open the moment she stepped foot on the Miller property. She tried not to dwell on it. Instead, she focused on what she could control, restoring order to her grandfather's chaotic legacy. The workshop had become her sanctuary, a place where she could bury herself in the meticulous task of cataloging every notebook, every loose page, every rusted metal fragment. She felt most at ease when she stood among Harvey's creations, gradually learning to see them not as random experiments, but as deliberate steps toward a singular vision. The more she touched his work, the more he stopped feeling like a distant, eccentric figure from her childhood, and instead began to resemble a man who had carried a tremendous burden of knowledge without anyone willing to believe in him. One afternoon, while she squinted through the dusty windows, she noticed movement in the yard. A gray-haired man wearing a sun-faded shirt approached the house slowly, carrying a paper bag in his hand. She recognized him vaguely from town. His name, after a moment of search through memory, rose to the surface. Mr. Henderson, her old high school physics teacher. He had always been soft-spoken and impossibly patient, the sort of man who treated every student as though they might be capable of something extraordinary. He greeted her with a gentle nod and explained that he had heard she was cleaning out her grandfather's place. There was no judgment in his tone, only curiosity tempered by a quiet respect. When she told him she had uncovered some of Harvey's old technical work, his eyes sharpened behind thin glasses. He asked if she might allow him to look, and although her instinct was to protect what she had found, something in his kind, steady manner made her trust him. Inside the workshop, he moved slowly, surveying the tables covered in papers and tools. He lifted one of the notebooks with careful hands and read a few lines before closing it and exhaling deeply. He told her that Harvey had once stopped by the school years ago to ask about scheduling lab time, hoping to test some of his devices, but the administration had refused him. They had dismissed him as a hobbyist, a man chasing impossible ideas. Henderson had always suspected that the old man's reputation had blinded them to what he may actually have been capable of. Now, standing amidst the evidence, he seemed both saddened and vindicated. After studying the documents in silence, he offered to help her organize them. He said no innovation, especially one that carried such immense potential, should be left vulnerable to dust, decay, or people's assumptions. She accepted the help gratefully, relieved to have at last someone in Destrayville who did not look at her with suspicion. Over the next few days, others came as well, trickling in one by one, drawn perhaps by curiosity or guilt, or simply the novelty of seeing the infamous Miller workshop open for the first time in decades. Some offered tools, others simply brought food or supplies. A woman Sarah barely remembered from childhood arrived with a box of new filing folders, explaining that Harvey had once fixed her air conditioner free of charge during a brutal heat wave. A pair of teenagers, who had previously been among those whispering at the edge of the property, returned sheepishly asking if she needed help clearing junk out of the yard. She accepted, though she could read the uncertainty in their faces. They didn't know if they believed the rumors about a discovery, but they wanted to see for themselves if anything felt different here. As more hands joined the effort, the oppressive silence around the property began to shift. The house felt less abandoned, less haunted by neglect. The workshop, once dense with clutter, gradually opened up as tables were reorganized and shelves were cleared. Even the air began to smell more alive, tinged with sawdust and fresh paper, instead of only dust and oil. But the growing interest also brought more attention, and not all of it was welcome. When the representatives from the Energy Corporation arrived, two men in crisp suits that did not belong anywhere near desert sand, Sarah felt her pulse lurch. They introduced themselves with polished smiles and explained that they were in town to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement concerning any intellectual property left in Harvey's possession. They implied, with a tone that bordered on rehearsed sympathy, that they had once attempted to collaborate with her grandfather, but that he had rejected their formal proposals. Sarah did not trust them. She saw the thinly veiled urgency in their eyes, the way they scanned each corner of the workshop, as though the secrets of her grandfather's work might be lying out in plain view. They insisted that they could offer her a generous sum to obtain the documents, far more than the average estate sale could ever bring. But even without knowing the future of Harvey's invention, she could sense the disparity between their smooth assurances and their underlying hunger. Their offer felt like the same hand that might have once tried to take advantage of Harvey's brilliance when he stood alone. She refused politely but firmly. At that, the men exchanged a glance still polite, still smooth, but tinged with something darker, and left with the promise of returning. After they drove off, a suffocating unease settled into the pit of her stomach. She thought again of the bent window latch, of the whispers in town, of the footprints in the sand. She understood that danger did not always arrive with broken doors. Sometimes it came dressed in courtesy. Despite this, she pressed forward. She and Mr. Henderson spent hours reconstructing the order of Harvey's research, mapping out every stage of development, every shift in design logic. It became clear that Harvey had begun his work decades earlier, refining it through trial and error, until he arrived at something that bridged theory and practicality. What had looked like chaos at first now revealed a disciplined progression, a mind pursuing a single purpose with unwavering focus. The more she immersed herself in this work, the more she began to understand the loneliness her grandfather must have endured. He had carried the weight of an idea too large for the town that surrounded him and too far ahead for the world that ignored him. He had borne disappointment, rejection, and isolation, yet he had never stopped. The realization filled her with admiration and an ache she could not quite name. Word soon reached the university lab. Within a week, a team of specialists arranged to visit the property. They arrived in a cluster of cars, carrying laptops and equipment, their manner professional, but tinged with something like excitement. They treated the documents with reverence, scanning and photographing each page. They peppered her with questions. Had Harvey ever attempted full-scale prototypes? Did she know whether he had communicated with other scientists? Had he kept additional notes elsewhere on the property? She answered as best she could while observing the way their faces changed each time they uncovered another equation or sketch, interest sharpening into respect, then into astonishment. One of the younger researchers murmured that this was a once-in-a-generation discovery, the kind of scientific milestone that textbooks struggled to predict. Even Mr. Henderson, standing in the corner with arms folded, seemed humbled by what he was witnessing. The scientists left with promises to return and conduct a more thorough analysis. As their cars disappeared down the road, Sarah felt a faint tremor inside her, not fear, but a growing certainty that she was now standing at the edge of something irreversible. That evening, as the wind blew softly across the desert and twilight settled into long shadows, Sarah walked through the workshop alone. She traced her fingers along the newly organized shelves and stacks of preserved notebooks. Everything looked cleaner, brighter, filled with momentum. This was no longer just a forgotten room where a lonely inventor had worked. It had become a place of renewal, one where voices from the past and present threaded together into something larger. But with every step forward came new challenges. The town's whispers had grown louder. Some accused her of exploiting her grandfather's reputation. Others speculated wildly about riches hidden beneath the property. A few even hinted that she had fabricated the discovery to manipulate public attention. She ignored them as best she could, but their words clung to her like desert burrs, impossible to shake off entirely. Still, she pressed on. Perhaps, she thought, part of honoring her grandfather meant learning to withstand the judgment he had endured for so long. Perhaps this work was meant to be done not in spite of adversity, but because of it. As she locked the workshop for the night and looked up at the star-flecked sky, Sarah felt a sense of resolve settle into her bones. She had not asked for this responsibility, nor had she expected it. But now that it had found her, she understood that she could not turn away. The journey ahead would be difficult, perhaps even dangerous, but it was one she was ready to take. Her grandfather had worked alone for years, but she would not. She had allies now, unexpected ones, and a cause that was too important to abandon. The desert wind whispered across the yard, brushing against her with a gentle insistence. It carried with it ghosts of the past and the faint promise of what lay ahead. In that quiet moment, beneath the wide Arizona sky, Sarah felt something she had not felt since arriving in Destrayville: hope. It began, as so many turning points in Sarah's life seemed to, with a thin white envelope that did not look like much. By then, several weeks had passed since the first team of university specialists had come and gone, leaving behind a blur of technical jargon, careful excitement, and promises of a formal review. The days in between had been filled with the steady, almost meditative grind of work, cataloging Harvey's papers, answering cautious questions from townspeople, and trying to build some semblance of a routine for Noah amid the flux. The envelope arrived on a warm morning that hinted at the coming summer. It bore the letterhead of the Regional Energy Commission, the body that oversaw renewable initiatives and patents throughout several states. Sarah carried it into the kitchen, the heels of her boots knocking softly against the worn floorboards. Noah watched from the table where he was tracing rough sketches of the strange towers and heat exchangers he had come to associate with his great-grandfather's work. She stood for a long moment with the envelope in her hand. It was not fear that made her hesitate exactly. It was the knowledge that whatever lay inside would likely shift their lives again, perhaps as dramatically as the first time she had lifted the lid of Harvey's hidden safe. Finally, she slid her thumb under the flap and unfolded the letter. The language was formal but clear. After reviewing the documents, simulations, and historical context, the commission had reached its conclusion. The system outlined in Harvey Miller's notes constituted an original and significant contribution to the field of renewable energy. Its core design was unlike existing thermal storage technologies and anticipated several contemporary approaches by decades. In their view, it was not a failed dream or a half-formed experiment, but a pioneering breakthrough, the first known example of its kind. They recommended that the design be protected, developed, and documented under its rightful origin. The Miller Thermal Gradient System, the letter called it, as if the name had always belonged there. Sarah read the letter twice, then set it on the table with trembling fingers. Noah stared at her, wide-eyed, waiting. She drew a long breath and told him, as simply as she could, that the people in charge of such things had agreed. His great-grandfather really had created something rare and important. The boy's face lit with a kind of quiet pride that made her throat tighten. The commission's approval opened a door that had before seemed only theoretical. The university that had first examined the papers sent a formal proposal within days. Their dean of engineering called her personally, his voice steady and measured, but threaded with excitement. They wanted to partner on the development of the system, to build prototypes, to study performance in controlled conditions, and eventually in real deployments across the desert. They believed the technology could become a cornerstone in the shift toward localized, resilient energy infrastructure. But there was, of course, the matter of ownership. Sarah listened on speakerphone at the kitchen table, her elbows propped near Harvey's notebooks. Noah sat silently nearby, pretending to read while his ears remained keenly tuned. The dean explained that in purely legal terms, the university could offer to buy out the rights entirely. It would simplify things, he said. The institution would assume liability, development costs, and all downstream negotiations. She and Noah would be more than comfortable for the rest of their lives. She thought of the two men from the corporation with their slick words and insincere sympathy. The offer from the university was different. It came wrapped not in predatory charm, but in earnest practicality. Still, when she glanced toward the workshop through the kitchen window, she knew her answer before she even spoke it. She told the dean she could not sell what did not belong solely to her. The work, she said, was not just a product to be acquired. It was the sum of a life that had been misunderstood and belittled, a legacy that extended through her and into Noah and beyond. If any partnership was to exist, the name attached to the design would have to remain. Miller, visible and permanent, not hidden behind a corporate imprint or folded into some neutral term that erased the story of how it had come to be. There was a long pause on the line. She half expected resistance, some careful negotiation designed to gently wear down her resolve. Instead, the dean surprised her. He said that, in light of the historical significance of the find, the university was willing to structure the agreement differently. They would treat the design as a discovered heritage technology, with the family retaining attribution rights and a share of licensing. The patents, documentation, and public-facing materials would all bear Harvey Miller's name, and by extension, the story of a solitary inventor in a desert town who had seen further than the world was ready to look. When the details were finally put to paper a week later, Sarah sat at the kitchen table late into the night, reading through each clause, determined not to fail her grandfather at the threshold he had never reached. The financial projections still made her head spin. Even with a conservative model, the valuation came close to what Jacob had mentioned in that first astonishing call. $50 million in potential licensing, perhaps more as the system reached maturity. But as she worked through each paragraph, what she found herself returning to, over and over, were the words that ensured permanence. The Miller thermal gradient system, repeated on every page, in every section that mattered. When at last she signed, her hand felt steadier than she had expected. The money did not arrive in a single explosion of wealth. It flowed instead in structured phases, tied to milestones and benchmarks and careful legal language. But from the beginning, Sarah knew she did not want to simply disappear into comfort. It did not feel like the right ending for this story, nor a beginning she wanted for Noah. A private fortune, isolated from the town and from the place where the idea had been born, would betray something essential about how Harvey had lived and what he had hoped to build. So with the first transfer of funds, she did something that made even the more cynical residents of Destrayville pause. She went to a local attorney and established a charitable foundation, incorporating it under the name the Harvey Miller Heritage Fund. Its mission was simple in wording, but broad in ambition: to preserve the history of independent innovation in harsh landscapes, to support education and research around decentralized energy systems, and to ensure that the story of one old man in a workshop did not fade into rumor again. When the papers were filed, the attorney asked if she was sure she could keep more. He said gently, reminding her that no one would blame a single mother for prioritizing her own security. She told him quietly that securing their future was part of her plan. But so was securing the meaning of what her grandfather had left behind. The fund, she explained, would support scholarships, community projects, and the upkeep of the property itself, which she no longer saw as a relic to be cleared out and sold, but as a living place, a node in a network of stories and future work. Word of the foundation spread through Destrayville faster than any rumor about hidden safes or corporate visits. People who had watched her warily now regarded her with a new, uncertain respect. At the diner, where a few months earlier voices had dropped when she walked in, conversations no longer fell silent. Instead, they shifted, slowly but unmistakably, into questions. What exactly had Harvey built? What did it mean that his name would be on university walls and patent filings? And what did it say about the town itself that such a thing had grown here, unnoticed and underappreciated? The property soon became a construction site, then a campus in miniature. With funding from the foundation and matching grants from the university, crews arrived to shore up the sagging porch, replace the roof, and reinforce the workshop structure. Electricians rewired the house, not to erase its age, but to make it safe for visitors and equipment. The dusty rooms that had once seemed like mausoleums of forgotten tinkering were cleaned and repainted. New insulation went up behind walls that had once rattled in every strong wind. Yet through all these changes, Sarah insisted on keeping certain details untouched. The main work table in the workshop remained scarred and stained, its surface marked with the circles of old coffee mugs and the etched ghosts of diagrams. Harvey's original armchair stayed in the corner, cleaned but not reupholstered, its worn fabric a quiet testimony to the hours he had spent alone there, thinking, planning, refusing to give up. His notebooks, now carefully sleeved in archival covers, were returned to a central shelf behind glass, accessible for study but protected from hands that might not understand their fragility. By early fall, the transformation had begun to draw attention beyond Destrayville. A single-story annex was added beside the workshop, housing a lab space with benches, computers, and a small-scale test rig for the thermal system. Students from the university started making regular trips, some for day visits, others for short research residencies. They stayed in refurbished rooms at a nearby motel or occasionally on cots in the old house when schedules ran late and the work demanded that they remain. Noah threw himself into the bustle with a kind of steady enthusiasm that surprised even his mother. He liked showing the students where the hidden hatch in the floor had been, guiding them to the spot in the workshop where the safe had once sat. He helped carry tools, took notes for them when they worked outdoors, and peppered them with questions that ranged from basic physics to grand, almost philosophical musings about what it meant to harness heat from the desert. The researchers began to treat him not as a child underfoot, but as a junior apprentice, a fixture of the place. The Miller property, once pointed to in whispers as the home of the town's peculiar recluse, began to be discussed in different terms. People started calling it the center, or the lab, or simply Harvey's place, the last spoken now with something closer to affection than ridicule. Meetings for the foundation were held in what had once been the cluttered living room. Local teachers came by to ask if they could bring groups of students for tours. A bulletin board in the kitchen filled with notes about upcoming seminars, visiting engineers, and community events. The first full-scale demonstration of a working prototype was scheduled for late November, when the extremes of desert temperature would best showcase the system's capabilities. The rig, installed in a low, squat building near the edge of the property, resembled neither a traditional power plant nor any familiar household machine. It was an assembly of insulated tanks, piping, control valves, and a modest turbine linked to an inverter. It did not look like something worth $50 million or the reordering of a family's story. It looked like what it was, the physical manifestation of years of careful thought. In the days leading up to the demonstration, the property buzzed with an almost festival-like energy. Technicians checked and rechecked every connection. University staff set up monitoring equipment. A temporary tent was raised for town visitors, with folding chairs and a refreshments table donated by the diner. It seemed as though all of Destrayville had decided to show up. People who had once rolled their eyes at Harvey's name now arrived with grandchildren in tow, pointing out the house and telling stories about how he had once fixed their irrigation pump or generator. Sarah moved through the crowd in a kind of quiet stupor, greeting people, answering questions, making sure Noah had eaten, that the guests knew where to stand, that the researchers had everything they needed. She caught sight of Mr. Henderson near the front row of chairs, sitting with his hands folded on his knees, his eyes shining with a warmth that made her chest ache. This, she thought, was as much his vindication as anyone's. When the time came, she stood beside the lead engineer from the university and listened as he explained, in plain language, what they were about to see. He spoke of heat captured during the fiercest hours of the day, stored and then transformed into steady electricity long after the sun sank below the horizon. He spoke of small towns and remote communities that could someday rely on systems like this rather than distant, fragile grids. And then, with a nod to her, he gestured toward the control panel. Sarah did not fully understand every readout, but she understood enough. She watched the screen as temperatures, pressures, and flow rates moved from idle to active. There was a moment, a breath, in which nothing seemed to happen. Then the turbine began to spin. It did not roar. It whirred, a contained, confident sound that grew into a steady hum. Lights flickered to life along the exterior of the lab building, then in the workshop, then in the house itself, all fed by the new system. The crowd murmured. Someone began to clap, and the applause spread, tentative at first, then growing. Noah grinned so broadly she worried his face might ache later. He tugged at her sleeve and asked, almost reverently, if this meant that the house was now running on great-grandpa's machine. She told him it did. That night, long after the visitors had gone home and the technicians had retreated to their laptops and data logs, she stepped into the yard alone. The desert was cool and expansive around her. Above, the sky was a deep sheet of stars, fractured only by the dim glow from the house and lab. The hum of the turbine bled softly into the dry air, a new kind of heartbeat under the familiar quiet of the land. She looked back at the house. Lights shone in windows that had once been clouded by years of neglect. Behind one of those panes, she could see Noah at the kitchen table, bent over a notebook, drawing as he so often did now. She did not need to open the door to know that Harvey's notebooks, preserved and labeled, sat on a shelf in the next room, watching over the new work in progress. In that moment, the full scale of what had happened settled upon her with gentle force. Her grandfather's story had stretched across a lifetime of frustration and solitude, and ended, at least on paper, in modest means and a reputation of eccentricity. Yet his work had not died with him here in a dusty house on the edge of Destrayville. It had waited. It had waited for conditions to change, for a different moment, for someone with enough stubbornness and enough faith to sift through the wreckage and recognize its worth. She remembered the first day she had stepped back into this yard, feeling only the weight of obligation. She remembered the suspicion in the eyes of strangers at the gas station, the derision in the voices at the diner, the bent window latch that had signaled someone's attempt to breach the unknown, and she remembered, just as clearly, the first time she had opened Harvey's safe and seen the drawings that would reset the course of her life. Now, standing beneath the brilliant stars, she saw the arc, the way it had all bent toward this point. The money, those dizzying figures that would pay for Noah's education, secure their home, and seed the fund felt almost secondary. What mattered more, deep in the place no legal paperwork could ever touch, was that the world now knew the truth. Harvey Miller had not squandered his years on pointless contraptions. He had built a bridge between eras, between old stubborn ingenuity and new collective effort. And the town that had once dismissed him now pointed to his house with pride. Days turned into weeks, and the changes continued to ripple outward. The foundation began awarding its first small scholarships to local students interested in science and engineering. Visiting researchers proposed outreach programs, bringing hands-on demonstrations to the school where Mr. Henderson still taught part-time. A mural appeared on the side of a building on Main Street, painted by a group of teenagers who had spent a summer volunteering at the center. It showed a stylized version of the lab rig, the house, and a figure in a broad-brimmed hat standing beside them, indistinct but unmistakably Harvey. Noah's class came on an organized field trip at one point. Sarah watched from a distance as her son led his classmates through the workshop, explaining in serious tones how his great-grandfather had used to sit at that same table and draw plans into the night. He spoke not as a child parroting adult phrases, but as someone who had internalized the story and made it his own. When his teacher asked the group what they had learned, one of the kids said that sometimes people who seem strange might just be working on something too big for everyone else to see yet. On evenings when the work quieted and the visitors trickled away, Sarah would sit at Harvey's old desk with a cup of tea and leaf through the notebooks again, not searching for anything new, but simply taking comfort in the familiar loops and lines of his handwriting. Occasionally, she would find a phrase in the margins she had missed before, some fragment of doubt or hope or humor that made him feel more reachable, less legendary. Once she came across a line written in the corner of a page filled with heat capacity calculations. "If this ever works, maybe they'll forgive me for being stubborn." She traced the words with a fingertip and whispered to the empty room that he had been more than forgiven. He had been understood. The town, too, underwent its own quieter transformation. The sharp edges of old gossip softened. Stories about Harvey's temper or odd hours became tempered by anecdotes of his unexpected kindnesses. People remembered him fixing generators after storms, refusing payment from those who could not afford it. They remembered how he had once argued, red-faced, at a town meeting about the need for more resilient infrastructure when everyone else laughed it off as overkill. Those same people now sat under the gentle whir of a system based on his designs and admitted, if only to themselves, that sometimes the difficult ones saw what the rest could not yet. In time, the Miller property ceased to be simply Harvey's place or Sarah's project. It became part of Destrayville's identity, a quiet point of pride that visitors were invited to see. The town that had once survived by clinging to outdated industries and fading reputations now found itself mentioned in articles about innovation and climate resilience. The old water tower, the diner, the school, the dusty streets, they all remained, but they were now framed by a different story. On a late winter afternoon, with the sky clear and the air crisp, Sarah stood once more at the edge of the yard, looking out toward the low hills. The hum of the system behind her blended with the flutter of a distant flag and the faint call of a hawk. Noah was in the lab with a graduate student watching a diagnostic run. The boys' laughter drifted on the wind. Somewhere, a truck engine started on the road, then faded. She felt tired, but it was a good tiredness, the kind that came from work that meant something and days that fit together into a pattern instead of a scramble. She thought of the path that had led here, of the girl who had fled to Strayville years ago, determined to put as much distance as possible between herself and the weight of a family name that drew mockery. That girl would not have believed this version of the future was possible. And yet, standing here, Sarah could not imagine it any other way. She walked back toward the house, pausing beside the window where Harvey's portrait now hung. It was not a formal painting, just an enlarged photograph from decades earlier, framed cleanly and set at eye level. He looked younger there, his hair still thick, his gaze already focused on some unseen horizon. For a moment, she simply regarded him, letting the silence between them fill with everything that had never been said. "Thank you," she murmured, though no one was around to hear. It was not just gratitude for the invention or the money or the change it had brought. It was gratitude for the truth of him, finally laid bare, and for the strange, winding road that had forced her to come back and see it. Inside, the lights glowed with a steady, gentle brightness. The rooms no longer felt like relics or burdens. They felt like chapters, open and connected, part of a story still being written. In the workshop, the old table stood beside a new workstation, the past and present sharing a single pool of lamplight. In the lab, screens displayed graphs that traced the breathing patterns of the system. In the kitchen, a calendar marked upcoming community workshops and foundation meetings. The house had changed, but it had not surrendered its soul. It had simply expanded to hold more lives, more voices, more possibility. As evening fell and the desert dipped back into coolness, Sarah joined Noah in the lab. Together, they watched the monitors for a while, listening to the soft, even hum that filled the space. Noah leaned against her arm, his eyes fixed on the lines of data creeping across the screen. He told her quietly that when he grew up, he wanted to build something new too, something that would help people the way this did. She told him that he already was part of that work, and always would be. Outside, under the wide sky, the Miller thermal gradient system gathered and released heat with patient precision, turning the harshness of the land into steady light. In a small town that had once been content to forget its strangest resident, the future now thrummed in the walls of an old house that refused to fall down. The story of a stubborn man in a workshop, his granddaughter, and a boy who learned to be proud of where he came from had settled into the foundations. The desert wind moved across the property with a sound like a long, slow exhale. For the first time in a very long time, everything felt, if not complete, then right. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and check out the next videos on the channel. And don't forget to share this one with your friends. It really helps the channel grow.